In Memoriam, a biographical sketch of Thomas Jensen, one of the early settlers of Butler County. The first settlers of Nebraska drove into the state with their wagons when it presented a very different appearance from what it does today. Looking over the map of the part of the south of the Platte River, gridironed by railroads and dotted by flourishing towns from 6 to 12 miles apart, and knowing that the intervening lands are divided into well-cultivated fields and pastures with comfortable farmhouses and beautiful groves in sight in all directions, it does not seem possible that no longer ago than 1870, the only railroad in this whole South Platte region consisted of some 20 miles of track which the B&M had began to lay on the line from Plattsmouth to Lincoln, although others were in contemplation. Remembering the condition of things then and comparing them with those that exist now, one can readily appreciate what was in Mr. Whittier's mind when he wrote with prophetic vision, "I hear the tread of pioneers, of nations yet to be, the first low wash of waves, where soon shall roll a human sea. And the waves of civilization old come from nearly every land under the sun, following the valleys of the streams at first, and then overflowing onto the open prairie. It was with high hopes and aspirations that each one located on this land and began the struggle of homemaking. Among the many enterprising, ambitious young men who had been drawn to Nebraska by the opportunities it offered was the late Thomas Jensen. The writer had become acquainted with him in 1869, and knowing that in Butler County, where he spent so many of the best years of his life, there are many old friends and neighbors of those early days to bear him in kindly remembrance, the thought came to him that they would be interested in reading a sketch of his life by one who had enjoyed his friendship for almost 32 years, and which is only ended by his death. He was born in Schleswig, Germany, November 26, 1845, being the second son of Karsten and Catherine Jensen, and was married in this county to Sarah Catherine Chamberlain, January 9, 1873. 6 children were born of this union: Paul Ernish, who died August 26, 1864, Nellie, Thomas and Frank, who were twins, Mabel and Harry, all but the first now living. He was overcome by the extreme heat and died at El Reno, Oklahoma, at 9 o'clock Saturday morning, July 13, 1901. He was buried in El Reno July 16th, all of his family being present with his 2 brothers, Jens and John, formerly of Nebraska but now of Oklahoma, and his only sister from Iowa, whose name has not been learned. Such as some of the main facts concerning one of the first settlers of Butler County, one who knew him as intimately as the writer can supply between the dates given, much regarding the private life of our friend and neighbor, which is well worthy of being made a matter of record, as illustrating how our young man in America, starting out in life with a little more capital than willing hands, a clear head, and a stout heart, managed to secure a comfortable home and be a useful and respected member of society. His father, being a farmer, his earliest work as a boy was in connection with tilling the land at a time when nearly all field work outside of plowing was done by hand labor. It was remembered that the province of Schleswig was then a part of Denmark, and the Danish language was taught in the schools which he attended and which he was obliged to study, much against his inclination, as his parents were staunch Germans, and the German was his mother tongue. They were persons of more than average intelligence, had a good common school education in the German language, and believed in having their children keep it up. When Uncle Tom's Cabin was translated into their language, a copy was obtained, which was read out loud by members of the family, with many of the neighbors joining in the circle of listeners. It was the first acquaintance many of them had with affairs in America. What a terrible impression they must have formed of our country. The oldest brother came to this country about 1864 and finally enlisted in the Union Army and became a lieutenant. Thomas told the writer that when his brother wrote back soon after his arrival that he had worked with a farmer and was to be paid at the rate of $100 a year, or so much of it as he might work. Not one of their neighbors would believe it. No farmer could afford to pay such wages, they said. It was preposterous. Jens was a good boy, but this was too much to believe. During the brief Schleswig-Holstein War, Thomas drove a provision wagon with the army, and told me that after a severe battle, he worked with the ambulance corps in picking up the wounded. The letters from his brother in America finally induced Thomas to come over. He told me that when he landed in New York, about 1867, he could not speak a word of English. Later, the whole family followed him, and having some money to start with the proceeds of the sale of the lease of land which he had in the old country, the elder Jensen bought land near Davenport, Iowa, where the boys helped him start farming again. Later, Thomas found work in the Wisconsin pineries for the winter. He told me that he made extra wages by shooting deer from a high platform which he built of poles, and where he watched at night as they came around to browse off of the treetops of the fallen timber. He shot several this way and sold the meat for use of the camp. On New Year's Day, 1868, Thomas and Jens landed in Lincoln, Nebraska, and engaged in anything they could get to do. Working together, they took contracts for digging wells around the city. When the first state house was built on the site where the present Capitol stands, Jens drove an ox team hauling stone for it from Beatrice. Thomas worked at various things, and for a while was at Nebraska City. He told me that to see what he could do more than anything else, and to save coach fare, he walked in one day from that city to Lincoln, 55 miles, starting early in the morning and getting to the end of the journey a little after sunset. The weather was so cool that he stood the walk nicely and thought he had saved a day's wages, not far from $5. He later made a bargain with a man named Donovan to give him what money he had saved up and worked for him for a year, in return for which he was to receive a deed for a quarter section of unimproved land in the southern part of Butler County and Ulysses Township, which agreement was finally carried out by both parties, though sometime before he got the deed, the fact of the case being that Mr. Donovan did not own the land in fee simple when he made the bargain, which Thomas did not know about. After he became older, he learned about men and their duplicity. Not long after his year's service was up, he joined the B&M engineering party, of which Mr. W.H. White was in charge, about October 1st, 1869, and went through with it on the preliminary survey of the line to Fort Kearny. The party came back late in November. He worked for the writer that winter as rodman on the construction of the Lincoln Division, leaving that position early in the spring of 1870 to open up his Butler County farm, which he determined should be his home. All of his training had led him up to this point, and here was the beginning of what he intended to be his life work. He had saved wages and built a little house, 14 by 16, to live in, and put up a solid stable for his team. It was a lonely life. Neighbors were few and far between, but were companionable and accommodating. One winter he taught the school in the Grimm district. He used to laugh about it afterwards. Teachers were scarce in those days, but the county superintendent of schools made it as easy as possible, with due regard to his official oath, for teachers to get a certificate. Those were the times that try men's endurance and their courage. Being of a home-loving disposition, he became tired of living alone. The writer had moved back to Massachusetts, and to him he wrote that he had found the one he wanted for a companion, but he wasn't quite certain whether she would take a favorable view of the matter. Early in 1873 came a letter saying that he had been successful with the chosen one and all is well, that he had built lean-to on his home for a kitchen, and that he and his wife were as happy as larks. And why should they not be? There was a farm with the creek running through it, and growing timber along its banks, enough for useful purposes, among which the birds made music every morning close to the house. He had what money could not buy, youth and health, with a life partner whom he implicitly trusted, and who loved and trusted him in return. Surely this was enough to nerve his arm and strengthen his courage and the struggles that were found to come, for there were obstacles to be met and trials to be passed through. There were seasons of drought then as well as now. Produce must be hauled from 20 to 40 miles to market. Then came the terrible plague of the grasshoppers. Still he kept his faith in the soil and pushed his way steadily ahead. cheered by the companionship of the partner in the cottage, and delightful associations of the home into which had come to innocence and beauty of childhood, with his love and laughter. With such a backing, he faced trouble and discouragement with unflinching courage. And there were dark days in those years, as many can testify. None more so than when the death angel took away the firstborn. One sultry night in August 1874, and it was with soaring heart that they laid him in the grim cemetery, in the presence of the group of sympathetic neighbors. For a time it seemed as if the sunlight had gone out of their home, never to come back. As the years came and went, a little grave on the hillside was not forgotten, but their grief was chastened and healed by the coming of the other children to soothe and comfort them. The country began to settle up around them, and the farm produce brought good prices. He finally bought another team, and not long after that, contracted for another quarter section of land near him. This he broke up and put to wheat. He told me that he took enough off of the first season to more than pay for the land before he had paid out $1 for it. The act was characteristic of the man, and it was one of the lessons to be derived from a review of his life that persistence, unremitting, and careful effort is bound to win in the end. His material progress was now in a short thing. He was known as a genial companion, an accommodating neighbor, and a good general manager of his own affairs. It cannot be otherwise than that he should take a prominent part in public matters. When the Lincoln and Northwestern Railroad was projected from Lincoln to Columbus, he was one of the most active at the public meetings held in the interests of voting bonds for that road, which was finally carried. It ought to be stated here that after the road was built, he was in no ways connected with the methods that led to their repudiation. He served 2 regular terms and 1 extra session in the legislature, being elected from Butler County for the years 1881 and 1883. Afterwards, he received the nomination for state senator, but failed to be elected. He possesses the confidence of his neighbors, had a large acquaintance with public men, and his credit was good. The benefit that secures from reviewing the life of such a man continues from the lessons that may be derived from his experience. While the biographer records his success with willing pen, he is morally bound to note wherein at one time he made a grave mistake, which in its consequences was far-reaching, and he does this in the spirit of kindness, with the hope that it may so influence the younger generation who ponder over it, as to warn them against failing to a like error. At this time, by habits of industry and good management, he had acquired title to 1,480 acres of land. He had literally obeyed the scriptural injunction to be, quote, diligent in business, unquote, and stood in high public regard for a man of his age. But now came an occurrence which was such a radical departure from his usual careful and cautious management as to change the whole current of his life. The demon of unrest that is common among Americans had so overcome his usual caution that it made him dissatisfied with the slow but sure returns from the farm and his association with men who had been temporarily successful in dealing on the Chicago Board of Trade, induced him to make a slight venture himself, which resulting favorably led him to extend his operation in that direction. The result of this unusual departure from a safe business is soon told. It is the same old story of the lamb and the wolf, finding its duplicate in hundreds of sorrowful cases, where men, having accumulated a competence, have been led to think they could successfully fit themselves against the practiced gamblers of the board. After getting as many as they can in the enclosure, the trap is sprung, and the game is in their hands. The market suddenly went the other way, as it always does, and the property accumulated by years of patient industry, unremitting work, and careful planning was nearly all swept away in a moment. It was a terrible blow, but he was still in the prime of his life and health. He made a trip to Oklahoma in 1889, and seeing the opportunities, there he removed with his family to the territory, settling on land close to the flourishing city of El Reno. He served as County Commissioner of Canadian County in the early days of the territory and worked for an elevator company, buying grain at one time, finally engaged in buying and selling real estate on commission. The opening of the Indian reservation to settlement brought a great many people into the territory. His business prospered, this season particularly, as well as the previous one, have been more than commonly profitable ones. He had recovered from the losses made in Nebraska and had got on his feet again. His 2 daughters were well married, and his twin boys had reached the age of manhood, occupying honorable and useful positions in business with good prospects of advancement in proper time. He now had in mind to carry out a plan, which he had kept in view ever since he landed in New York as a young man and an entire stranger to a country and its ways, which was that when he could afford it, he would visit his native land and look again on the scenes of his childhood. Many of our Butler County citizens have done that and have returned to their homes in this country, all the more satisfied to live under a Republican form of government. The common trait of humanity to have hallowed memories of their birthplace, and cheerless indeed must have been the childhood of one who does not. He told me in the days when we worked together, when he was a young lad, that he helped his father plant a tree, who said that it should be known as Tom's tree. And sometime, he said, I intend to go back and see it. He loved farm life and was never so happy elsewhere as at home with his family. He delighted to walk about the pasture among in stock. Though a very practical man in business, there was a strong theme of practical sentiment and his makeup which harmonized with his surroundings. All the various voices from the woodland, the whistle of the quail, the cooing of the turtle doves, the distant lowing of the cattle, the rustling of the wind among the leaves of the cornfield, and all the various sounds heard in the country made up a symphony from nature in which he took inexpressible delight. When he and his brothers were boys, they used to sleep in the upper part of the house, and he would recall how they enjoyed listening in the night to the rain falling on the roof. Many a person along in years has pleasant memories of that. Somewhere he came across a poem which pleased him by a charming way. It alluded to this: every tinkle on every shingle found an echo in the heart. Just before the closing days of the legislature in 1881, he invited the writer to be present at the last session, an invitation which was accepted. In the evening, we attended a drama at the Funk Opera House called The Colored Guard, enacted by the students of the State University. The parts were well sustained throughout and won much applause from the audience. The play was spectacular in character and abounded in effect. Very likely, there are many former students of the university who will remember it. I think Mrs. M.D. Towns, who was then Mrs. Wimberley of Ulysses, took a prominent part. One of the scenes was supposed to represent a campfire in the mountains of East Tennessee, around which workout are the group of Union men. To pass away the time, each one was calling on to sing, and one of the songs contained these words: "Wherever I may roam, I don't forget that home it ever was so dear to me, for it's many times a day that my thoughts they fly away to that little German home across the sea." The singer was a rare artist, and there was a certain pathos to the words which held the audience perfectly quiet, the very best tribute that could have been paid him. From what has been written, it will readily be understood why the song affected Mr. Jensen powerfully, and was such a favorite with him that he often sang the words over as we happened to be walking together. As touching as the words of that song is, it is not more pathetic than the desire he had held so long to visit the spot where he was born with being gratified. But man proposes and God disposes. Sometimes a biographical pen, if friendly, finds it hard to write if disposed to be truthful and just. But when it comes to the page on which personal characteristics are to be mentioned, it moves with even tenor and ready flow. When the writer first met Thomas Jensen in 1869, he was quite slim in figure, but active in movement. In complexion, he was almost purely Saxon, with clear-cut features in the keenest and sharpest light blue eyes that any man ever had. He had a manly, straightforward way with him that inspired confidence. His disposition was to be cheerful under hardships, which goes a long way with engineers. He was of an affectionate nature and would do anything for a friend that laid in his power, but was an active antagonist when his fighting blood was aroused. To the writer, he seemed to be one of those kind of men to whom fear is a stranger. If he had any enemies, they must own that he was a generous one. He had a keen enjoyment for humor, and some of the pleasantest associations the writer has of the time when, during stormy weather, he worked on a map, while Thomas read Great Expectations out loud in order to improve his English, the winter of 1869 and 1870. His own early trails and privations made him generous to those who were undergoing similar experiences, and the unfortunate knew they could always get help from him. Certain it is that no one in distress ever went away from his house empty-handed, if they were worthy of being helped, and often that did not make any difference when it invoked pity. The influence of such men's lives remains long after they have passed away, just as the zodiacal light of the sun continues to illuminate the landscape long after it has sunk below the horizon. And now, old friend and companion, for a little while, farewell. The biographer must stop, conscious that his work is incomplete, and that it might have been better done by an abler hand. But he thinks that to none was the service have more strongly appealed, having an equal intimacy with the subject. Hence the pen is laid away sorrowfully, and will no farther seek his merits to disclose, or draw the frailties from their dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God. Charles H. Sargent, The Banner Press, David City, Nebraska.